Hey class, today we're going to be talking about negative powers of 10. So the first thing we need to talk about when we're talking about negative powers of 10 is just how the exponents work. You'll sometimes see a number that looks like this, where you have a small number in the bottom, or a big number in the bottom, I'm sorry, and a smaller number up top. So this is what we call something with an exponent. So that's broken up into two parts. We've got the base down here on the bottom, and we have, you could think of this as two different ways. You could think of this as a power, or you can think of it as an exponent. But basically what it's telling you to do is you take the base and you multiply it, in this case 5 times itself. In this case over here in the middle you'll see 10 to the 4th. That means we take 10 and we multiply it by itself 4 times. So we're talking about negative powers of 10, which is basically the same idea, except instead of the base, we're taking the reciprocal of the base. Meaning, we take our base and we flip it upside down, we put a 1 over top of it. So let's get into some of these we-dos together. So the exponential form is going to look like 10 to the negative 4th. Again, we're talking about negative exponents, so we're going to kind of review positive and negatives. When I'm talking about expanded form, that means I'm going to basically do what I did up here. I'm going to take the reciprocal, which is 1 over 10, and I'm going to multiply it by itself 4 times. So that was 1, this is 2, this is 3, and that is, I'm messing up, 4. So 1 over 10 times itself 4 times. Fraction form, I think there's two different ways to think about it. You could write it as 1 over the exponent, so 1 over 10 to the 4th, or we could actually figure out what 1 over 10 to the 4th actually looks like. So if I'm multiplying all this together, I know the numerator is going to be a 1, because 1 times 1 times 1 times 1 is 1. And then the bottom I'll do 10 times 10 times 10 times 10, which ends up being 10,000. And then lastly, standard form, I just want to figure out what 1 over 10,000 actually is, which in this case is the decimal 1/10,000th. So you could kind of write on your paper that standard form is pretty much looking for the decimal form. You're not always going to start with exponential form. There might be that opportunity for you to start with the expanded form and kind of work backwards. So in this case, expanded form has 3 1 over 10s, which means my exponential form is going to be 10 to the negative 3. My fraction form, again, I'm pretty much just taking the expanded form and I'm going to write it a couple different ways. One of them being the exponent form, 1 over 10 to the 3. Or I can actually figure out what 10 to the 3 is. So I could write 1 over 1,000 as well, which is the decimal 1/10,000th. So already we can notice a couple different patterns. You can see my exponent is a 4 here, which means I'm going to have 4 10s on the bottom. You'll notice my exponent here is also a 4, and I'll have 4 zeros here and 4 zeros here. Next, let's start with a fraction form. This one's pretty easy since there's only one of them, which means because there's 1/10, my exponent is going to be a 1, but remember it's the reciprocal, so it's negative. And then again, my decimal form, I'm taking this 1/10 and I'm just going to turn it into the decimal 1/10. Next, I have what looks to be 100th. So if I wanted to write 100th as a decimal, I could write it as 1 over 100. And then again, because there's 2 zeros, my other fraction form might look something like this, 1 over 10 to the 2nd. Exponent form, again, because there's 2 zeros, or 10 to the 2nd, I'm going to have 2 of those, which means my exponent form is to the negative 2nd. Got a couple more. This one's a trick question. So if we notice my pattern, negative 1 here meant there was 1/10, 1/10, and 1 0 here. Negative 2 meant there were 2 10s, a 2 here, 2 zeros. 10 to the 0 actually means there's not going to be any zeros at all. So there's just a 1 with no zeros, which makes sense, right? Because if we take 10 to the 0, anything to the 0 is 1. So there's going to be a 1 here, and there's going to be a 1 here. Lastly, to kind of complete the circle, next we're talking about positives, just so we can kind of wrap everything up nice and neat. Here, because there's 10 to the 2nd, 10 to the 2nd or there's 2 10s, I'm sorry. Because there's 2 10s, that means I need to write 10 to the 2nd And 10 to the second, I know I could write a couple different ways. I could write 10 to the second over 1 like this. Or maybe I just want to write what 10 to the second is. It's 100. And then I know 100 over 1 is 100. So this is what our notes look like. There are a couple that I want you guys to do together. Looks like we start with each box and then you kind of have to fill in the rest, but we will go over this in class.